Come to this Facilities Master Plan Town Hall. I look forward to this opportunity for us to see what HGA has put together for us and to hear from you what questions and input you have. I'm Matt Hennis, the President of the Academic Senate, and there are refreshments in the back. It looks like you've seen that. The event is being both streamed and recorded for posterity. And so after Dr. Jonas' opening remarks and HGA's presentation, there will be a Q&A period during which we will have microphones floating about the room that Alex Buckelhide has. If you have a question or comment and you want it to be heard on the recording, you need to have a microphone in your hand. That's my piece. Without any further delay, I will introduce the president of PCC, Dr. Jonas.
Thank you. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, there's one Kansas City Chiefs fan in the room. He's long-suffering, okay, just so mazel tov on that one. Especially because Andy Reid he played football for Glendale College. He's one of us. He's a community college guy, so this is good. So welcome everyone here. The Facilities Master Plan is really important for the college because it is what sets the course for what our college and all of our locations are going to look like, what they look like now, and what we think they should look like going forward. And it's actually perfect timing since we have completed a draft of our educational master plan, and it's going to be going through its final vetting through shared governance in February and early March so that we can have the board approve it at their March board meeting on March 19th or 20th. And that is actually the foundation for the Facilities Master Plan. And I think you'll see that when these fabulous folks from HGA, our consultants, talk to you about how the plan has come to be and the kinds of questions that they've asked, the kind of information that they've received, not from a whole variety of folks. They've met with a lot of different folks here on campus. So your being here and asking questions and listening is really important because every single time we have shared this with a group, we've gotten some pretty interesting feedback on it. We've gotten some ideas. We even had a question of where should those new locker rooms go for the swimming pool? And do we want it on Bonnie or do we want it on the other side? It's those kinds of things. So I really encourage you to listen to what's gone on so far. And I want to emphasize that when you do a facilities master plan, I've heard some people say, well, if you're bringing a draft of a plan for a town hall, that means all the decisions have been made and there's nothing left to do. And actually, that's not the case. What we've done is take our best stab at it of what it should be, but there are always going to be ideas. There are always going to be things we haven't thought about, and that's where all of you come in. This is your opportunity to give us your best thoughts on what we have because it's a living document. And even once it's done, even once the board has approved it, there may be things that wind up not looking exactly like what's in the plan, and that's okay too. I mean, we live in a very fluid environment, and so what you're going to see today is what we have as of February 3rd, 2020, and I think it's a really good product, what HGA has put together. And I'm excited about it. And I just, again, thank you for being here. I encourage you to ask questions. I do apologize that I'm not going to get to stay and listen to all of your questions because I have an appointment off campus that I've had for a long time. But because it's being recorded, I will be able to take a look at the kinds of questions. And you may be saying to yourself, I mean, seriously, you're going to do that? You're going to go and look at the questions that we asked? And the answer is yes. And the reason is it's important. It's important for me to understand what resonated with all of you and what maybe you had some questions about. And that's part of my due diligence as the president here. So with that, these guys are awesome, and I think they've done a good job, but you'll get to see for yourself. So with that, are you gonna introduce, or they're gonna introduce? Yay! All right. I know. It's like, did you see that? He came up doing it.
Thank you, Dr. Jonas. Quite an intro. So, okay, we've got a lot to cover today, and we actually presented the previous update on this a couple months ago, and that was fluidity. That was a word that was used, and there was a lot of fluidity back then, and it's taken a lot of shape since then, but it's still not done. So we're going to give you kind of an update on where things are right now. I'm Kevin Donahue with HGA Architects. These are my colleagues, Louis and Joe. And our other colleague, Ina, who was at the previous session, was not able to be here today. But she is really kind of the mastermind behind some of the metrics and the numbers that are yielding the recommendations that we're presenting. So I'm going to just walk through this today. The agenda for what we're hoping to cover is just a reminder of the scope that really is being captured by this overall effort that we've been working on since last summer. And then the deliverable, essentially everything that we've been doing is leading up to this document that will capture all our recommendations. So we're going to give you a preview of that and how it's organized. We really want to make sure that we're hitting the right notes, capturing the right info. So even though that has largely taken shape, there's plenty of room to refine and reorganize the information that's included within that. Then we wanted to walk you through kind of the process that we've gone through to get there and to make sure that everyone understands the different groups we've met with. I think it's so important that a document like this have the right level of participation, that it's such a representation of the campus community, and that it's necessary to have all those voices heard. And then we're going to walk you through, at the end of this presentation, essentially our recommendations. At the end of the day, what this is trying to outline is the work that should be done to transform the campus, both Colorado campus and the other locations in the next 10 years. And that means getting to the level of projects, what projects we recommend, which buildings we recommend staying put and being renovated versus being demolished and replaced. So in a lot of ways for Colorado, kind of reorganizing the campus. And it is largely a representation of the educational master plan, so this is the physical manifestation of that. But the tenets of the career communities are really represented here, or at least they are intended to be. So, general overview of our scope. The charge we had coming to the table for this effort was to pick up where we left off. For those who may not know, we started this effort back in 2015 and went through almost 2 years of work to develop a document, but then it went on hold for a number of reasons, and a lot of the key players, the key decision makers changed, and so it went on hold for a while, then came back last year. So the idea is really to pick up where we left off as much as we could, knowing that the goals, the aspirations, the general objective of this has changed quite a bit. And one of the big things that changed was the enrollment projection. Went down to 25 FTEs. So it's a much more realistic projection, and I think that's really the theme of this updated master planning effort in general, is that it's far more grounded. The original effort was very aspirational, which is important, but if you get too aspirational, it becomes difficult to implement. It's not realistic. So that is something we've really, that was our charge here, and hopefully we've taken it much closer to that. As I mentioned, the career community focus, that was something that developed since the original effort and has really framed how we're envisioning the organization of the campus from a physical standpoint in terms of where programs are located. And then just the quick burn nature of this, the fact that we really got started in October. We started talks in the late summer, but this effort really started in October leading up to this month, which is very quick for a master planning effort. So we thank everyone for being able to make time as needed to provide input, because even if you streamline an effort like this, it's very important that you don't shortchange participation, making sure that you get that level of input so that we really can all agree on the recommendations that are being proposed. So this is just a snapshot of our schedule since October, since we started the effort. The effort has really been broken down into 3 phases. The initial phase was investigation. That's where we really spent some time getting to know the campus, getting to know the academic programs, getting to know all the parts and pieces of what makes PCC unique, and as well as just understanding the physical conditions that we're working with here, the state of each building, the state of the built environment, et cetera. And then we went into actual master planning, where we're starting to look at recommendations for, based on that starting point, what makes sense? What are the priorities? What are the things we should be focusing on? And then that final phase that we're in right now is deliverables, where we're really focusing on taking those recommendations and capturing them in a document in that final report that will be distributed. So the deliverable is broken up into 3 main parts. This is a little more simplified than what will actually be in the table of contents. But essentially the guiding principles, what we wanted to capture here was just the high-level aspiration, aside from any recommendation for a project or physical upgrades, just aspirationally in terms of the general identity of PCC, what's important, what are we looking to achieve here? And so we held some town hall meetings at the start of the process to go through that. Then really capturing the current state of PCC and using that as a kind of a jumping off point for the basis for our recommendations. And then the third category is obviously the recommendations for future state. So that would be the projects that are necessary to get there and how that ties into a potential bond measure for funding. So this is a snapshot of the fuller table of contents from the deliverable, and then a few example pages to just show kind of the flavor of what you can expect in terms of how it's being organized. But essentially, there are a lot of charts and graphs and things that show the metrics of how we reasoned it. Everything is justified. We're not just making recommendations because it sounds cool, but there are a lot of metrics and analysis behind it. So that'll all be part of the report. And then a physical representation. We understand that for master planning, it's so important to have those images, those graphics that kind of tell the story of how the campus would change over time under this plan. So the image you see at the bottom right corner is kind of the snapshot view that we show of the campus that shows the different stages and then the final build out after that 10-year period.
Hi everyone, my name is Joe Sion, and I'm going to touch on the process that we used and developed through the last few months in preparation of the facilities master plan. So I think Kevin mentioned that we started with visioning, an outreach, and asking some simple questions: what to keep, what to discard, what to add. We were looking for input at that time, and this was done through touching or addressing a few different groups on the campus through a initial town hall meeting. We then met regularly with executive cabinet. We met with various focus groups on the campus to talk about specific topics such as parking and wayfinding. We then met with the academic senate a couple of months ago. And then we also had a session with the ASO student body to solicit their input as well. So all of this input was influential in development of the facilities master plan. We then took a look at assessing the current state. That includes enrollment, program, as Kevin mentioned, the career communities. We also looked at the physical characteristics of the campuses, the Pasadena City College campuses, including the infrastructure, wayfinding, sustainability, and parking was a big focus as well. Okay. And just to give you a little more detail, the infrastructure for the campus, the image on the left, I know it's hard to read, but we looked at what is the infrastructure serving the buildings right now, the utilities that are serving the building, and identified some areas of improvement which is reflected in the right image. So looked at what we have currently and then anticipating the improvements on the campus, what needs to be done to support those improvements. Okay. We also charted and measured parking on the campus and the impacts of parking in peak times when parking is at a premium here on campus, and analyzed that for not only Colorado but also the Foothill campus, Rosemead campus. So that went into the document in terms of recommendations as well. And for our wayfinding effort, we analyzed all the existing signage and wayfinding that's currently on the Colorado campus and the other sites, and came back to a new direction that PCC is taking with a new branding for the campus, which is reflected here in these images of the bright dream come due, the bright colors. So the wayfinding recommendations will be built upon this direction of new graphics, if you will. Also, as I mentioned, sustainability was one of our focuses, and in this case, we are recommending to follow a program under the STARS program. That's what it is it's a little bit different. You may be familiar with LEED, and LEED is more building-based, right? It's more focuses on buildings per se, whereas STARS is more campus-focused. So it takes into consideration what is the campus doing in terms of academics, engagement, operations. It's a more holistic way of looking at sustainability. And we're recommending that this be pursued and followed to develop a sustainability program on the campus. We did an initial scoring of the campus right now, and it looks like things that PCC is doing is actually very favorable, that it gets you into sort of an entry-level certification under the STARS program. So we think that's very encouraging. The idea is to then build further on that, on the things that you're doing now, and to continue that. Okay, then also part of our process, we looked at enrollment growth, the evolution of programs on the campus, and the facility requirements. And that really was categorized into some basic elements that we refer to as a framework for campus development, which includes rooms, and that's really what we're talking about is outdoor rooms in a lot of cases, the outdoor spaces. Pathways, how do you travel through the campus, you know, the walkways, the pathways that everybody uses on a daily basis. And then the boundaries, the edges of the campus as well. And this again was looked at on all the sites that we were working with. Then we started developing strategies for buildings to be demolished, open spaces to be enhanced or improved, parking improvements, and as Kevin mentioned, the career communities as a way of organizing programs on the campus. Just to dive a little bit further into enrollment and enrollment growth, we work to better understand the programs that are going to be projected to be growing on the campus. And it's largely in the sciences and math is where most of the growth will occur. And we charted this out so we can get have a good basis of understanding the facilities needed to support those kinds of programs. And then this is a graphic representation of the programs, the existing programs, and how they're anticipated to grow, just to put it in a sort of a volumetric or graphic way of looking at it. And again, I know this is kind of small to read here, but this is included in our deliverable, in our draft document that you'll probably be able to look at more closely. Okay. And all this somewhat translates into recommendations for facilities to be improved. So we're making some recommendations for new buildings on campus and recommendations for major renovations to occur, and then also minor renovations or modernizations to occur as well. And for many of you, this may look familiar. This was some notes taken from our last academic senate meeting that we had back in, looks like November, where we solicited input and took that into consideration as we developed various guiding principles. And here's a list of, a partial list really of the principles that we were following as we started developing the physical improvements on the campus. To clarify and cluster career communities, increase enhanced spaces for studying and socializing, expand food services, strengthen school identity, improve wayfinding, and increase parking. So these were really the primary guiding principles that we were following as we went through this effort.
Hello, I'm Louis Kaufman, and I'm going to walk you through a really brief explanation of what everything you just heard from Joe and Kevin, what that means in terms of really sort of the campus and what it might look like. First, I want to emphasize that what we're going to talk about today and what our focus has been for this exercise is not so much to define a specific, this is what it will be, or even a specific roadmap to get to somewhere, but it's actually a series of destinations that are optional, and they can go in a number of different directions over the next several years, depending on what happens on campus in terms of priorities and things like that. But it all coalesces into a physical place that reflects what we think is the most likely future for this campus in terms of enrollment and program and things like that. So that's why we're talking about that. And by the way, the information that they were just presenting is captured in about 200 pages of a document. So it's very extensive, but it's important for you to understand. There's a really, really deep analytical side to this that's the basis for doing what we're going to talk about here. So this is an aerial view of the existing campus, and we've just done a simple diagrammatic coding of all the buildings. I think it should be very familiar for you. And then we talk about how we take that and begin to develop a framework. Joe talked about that a few minutes ago, about rooms and pathways and boundaries. So with every campus, the outdoor spaces, the spaces between buildings, is really where a lot of community occurs. You have to understand that one of the most important things that occurs here for you as a student is that you will meet other people. And that is actually maybe the primary reason why you are here, is to develop relationships and have an interaction with other students in a very meaningful way. And a lot of those interactions often occur outside of a classroom or a lab or a specific program space. They occur in outdoor spaces. So one of the big thoughts behind the master plan is to really enhance that experience through really focusing on outdoor spaces. So we looked at the campus, and this image here is probably the ceremonial heart of the campus. It's obviously a historic heart of the campus, the reflecting pool facing Colorado Boulevard. And we thought about that space as being a space that probably is a sacred space, both in terms of its symbol of the campus, but also the character of it. It's very formal, it's symmetrical, it's classical, and there's a number of conditions that we thought might begin to inform other spaces on the campus as an idea about spaces that are important to students as well as to other visitors to the campus. So we looked at that space, and then we began to diagram where we saw existing rooms, as we call them, on the campus, a variety of different sorts. You can see the Colorado reflecting pool room there, bounded in red. The sculpture garden is another specific type of room. The plaza directly outside this building is another room. And then the space that's outside of Lancers, sort of before the athletic complex, is another kind of room. And you note that the buildings themselves are actually shaping the sort of boundaries of those rooms. And so we're looking at those spaces as how can we enhance the quality of those them being destinations within the campus and how they might sponsor other destinations. And then we also looked at pathways. How does one access the campus and how does one get to specific buildings, as well as how does one access those rooms? So this is a diagram of how we were looking at that and how we might clarify pathways. So if you think about the experience of a student who's coming here on a journey, of which this is part of that journey, the idea of moving to a destination with clarity and with effectiveness is really important. Not causing students, we talk about wayfinding here. Do I ricochet around campus and I'm lost, I don't know exactly where to go, or do I have a really direct, clear route, and do I have a sense of arrival when I get there? So that's a lot about what we're trying to do with this plan and these pathways. And then finally, we began to think about where could we create what we call empty chairs, all right? So as we talked about earlier, we went through a number of criteria to establish the condition of facilities and open spaces, and we thought carefully about what buildings could be renovated, kept as is, replaced, or removed entirely. And this diagram shows essentially all of the empty chairs that we ultimately arrived at as the most likely space for renovation. So you can see everything on the Colorado frontage here, including portions of parking lots, as well as removal of specific buildings like Building V, as well as the Science Village on the southeast corner. So you can see all these different empty chairs that we've created or are recommending creating. By the way, not all at once. So it's not a phasing diagram, but it's just, it's capturing all of them. And then we began to think about where we might create new facilities. So this building reflects the new science building that's going to be constructed on the east side of the campus. There's 4 other buildings, a STEM building, which would be on the far east corner, right adjacent to the science building. You can see that we're potentially looking at relocating the pool to the southeast corner. That's in the southeast corner down there. And then a major classroom building where the pool was. You can see that in that space there. And then finally, a new student services building, essentially in the location it is now, but a larger one. And there's some conditions there. We'll talk about that. So those are new facilities. And then we've talked about 2 major renovations of the buildings that are directly outside of our building. These are the major classroom buildings on the campus. They're shared facilities. And so we talked about that being part of the master plan as well. And then we talked about outdoor space, and boundaries. So one of the areas of opportunity for this master plan exercise is on the boundaries, and it's critically at the corners of the campus. So currently at all 4 corners, you're confronted with what we would characterize as sort of a unexercised opportunity. There's parking at the corner of each corner on Colorado, as well as signage. And then on the far corners on the south side, you have Science Village, and then you have another parking lot. So one of the tactics that we've recommended that the college employ is increasing the amount of green space there, so that your arrival point at all 4 of those intersections is about garden and landscape and not about cars and basically modular buildings. So you can see that here, and then also some enhancements about some new spaces. So the V building, which is directly north of the Arts building, we've recommended removing and creating a new green space linkage that goes across the campus now, connecting the Science Village, this new science complex, all the way to the west to the technology building, the building that's right beyond the library here. I'm sorry, the student store here. And then finally, some ideas about parking. Certainly, the structured parking here on Lot 5 and Lot 4 is highly successful. We're looking at a recommendation that Lot 4 expand as a structured parking, pulled back from the south edge of campus, so we still maintain that green space we talked about a few minutes ago. The conversion of the tennis courts on the west side to a new parking lot there, and then some smaller parking enhancements in the existing service lots. And then let's just go back in and lay in a diagram of a framework of the rooms and pathways that we talked about before. So you can see the rooms that we were talking about before, but in addition to that, some additional rooms that are now located in the center of the campus, specifically where Lancers Pass was and where V building was, and to the west of that. So you begin to sort of see a series of new opportunities for outdoor spaces. And by the way, these spaces would be more intentionally programmed, the new ones as well as the renovation of existing ones like this plaza out here, to enhance things like Wi-Fi connectivity, power for students to work with laptops, as well as surfaces for people to sit and actually study in protected weather, things like that. So that's all part of this plan here. And then, as we talked about, the career communities has always been an important construct under which we're doing this master plan. So the strategy right now is that the career communities, which you can see, and I won't go through all of them, are loosely identified as precincts which kind of share buildings and have their own buildings. And so everything from business and industry on the west side to the arts, just sort of north of the athletic complex, science and wellness, et cetera. So you're beginning to see a more fluid idea about how these communities might capture parts of the campus, but not hard boundaries. So this idea of shared boundaries and specific boundaries, we think is a successful and sort of modifiable approach as you move forward. And then finally, although there's been a lot more sort of developed, nuanced exploration of how you might phase this, this just captures one way of phasing this. It is not the determined, this is the phasing of it. But as we said at the beginning, it's a series of destinations that could be sequenced in a number of different ways. But one way we might do this is start on the east, recommend that you start on the east, and you would that would include creating a new STEM building on the east side of campus, as well as a new food facility in the sculpture garden, which we think could use some more activity and be a destination for students. So that's part of what we might recommend in phase one. Phase two might include doing all of the exterior enhancements on Colorado Boulevard and on Del Mar. And then phase three would include creating a new large-scale academic building, similar in scale to the building here, Building R, as well as the new plaza that's directly east of it. And then phase four is a renovation of Building R, and phase five, the main original academic building in the center of campus, and then phase six, parking enhancements, et cetera. So you can see there's ways of doing this, and we kind of captured it in one way you might do it in terms of the priorities. But next year the priorities could change, and you could go with a different strategy. I think that covers it. Kevin's going to talk about some of the satellite campuses.
Very quickly. So obviously there's a big focus on the Colorado campus, but to really envision a 10-year plan, the satellite locations also need to be considered. Foothill being the most prominent in terms of its footprint. And so our recommendation here really is tied to the new STEM building. When the Serafian replacement building opens up, much of the program that's at Foothill, the nursing program, is going to be relocated back to the Colorado campus, which will open that up. But there is a recommendation for another academic building there. And so for all these recommendations, we're giving an approximate size. There isn't really a set program for these. So when you see those block diagrams, that's as much detail as we're getting into. We're not getting into the actual the configuration or the building design. So for here, just given the scale of and the context of the existing satellite campus, we felt that it would make sense to do a two-story building, approximately 24,000 square feet. And then with Rosemead, the challenge there is parking. There's a parking analysis that showing that it's not too maxed out, but obviously there have been some accounts that parking is a challenge there. So that's something we're going to dig into a little more, but the recommendation there would be also to place a similarly sized new building there as an expansion that will help make Rosemead a little more autonomous in terms of some of the facilities and the programs that it can offer. And then with PCC Northwest, this is pretty minor in terms of the recommendations we're making to help kind of just facilitate what's already happening there. And that is the presentation. So now we can open it up to a Q&A for any of the topics that we covered here or anything else that you might have on your mind. And remember, you need a mic, so we're going to have to let Alex get that to you.
Hi, thank you. I heard a lot of talk about the outside of campus, but no talk about the actual classrooms and the spaces that students use to learn, which I would think, I mean, it's nice to meet people, but it's not really why they're here.
So yes, that is a big part of what we're focusing on here. This presentation that we just gave you is a summary in every sense of the word. As I think Joe or Lewis mentioned, the document is a couple hundred pages. And that is one of the things, pedagogically, it's very important that we set a standard and kind of make sure that the future projects are accounting for kind of evolving modes of teaching and really dialing into the appropriate distribution of classroom size throughout the campus to meet the needs. And there's somewhat of a discrepancy in the sense that some of the analysis is not yielding the need for great classroom expansion, but nevertheless, we're accounting for the fact that there is a sense within the community, the campus community, that is necessary. But that'll be articulated in the report, certainly, in terms of how that is accounted for.
Okay, and I just had a follow-up question, because one of the things that we've talked about in a couple of the meetings and things I've been to is who is responsible for classroom design? Is there someone at your firm who understands teaching and what needs to be happening in a classroom, or is it, like, it hasn't been clear to us?
I see. So yes, we certainly can do that. That's something we do very regularly. But as part of this effort, as part of the master plan, we're not really getting into that granular level. So we will capture certain high-level best practices and aspirations for how classrooms should evolve on a more global scale at PCC, both at Colorado and the satellite campuses. But in terms of getting into the classroom design for any recommended new building, that would be the responsibility, the task of the future team who would be designing that building to get into that level of detail. Does that answer the question? Yes. Okay.
Thanks for this presentation. Is my mic on? I think it is.
Yep.
Oh, great. Thanks. My name's Robert. I teach in the English department here. And I've got a question that relates to the sustainability aspect of the plan. Let's say in 2022, there are federal mandates under the Green New Deal that any campus in the nation that's applying for funds has a facilities plan that will get the carbon footprint of the campus cut in half within 10 years, by 2030. Does this plan with the sustainability aspect, which I'm assuming doesn't envision cutting the carbon footprint in half by 2030, maybe that's a false assumption on my part, but does this plan have the flexibility to respond to federal mandates for cutting carbon footprint fairly quickly?
I would say generally the answer is yes. As we mentioned, this is meant to be a living document and not something etched in stone, where it can adapt to new conditions and new requirements over time. So we're providing a framework, and the sustainability measures, the recommendations, are really on a sliding scale. So typically, the more ambitious you get with sustainability, the higher the dollar value goes. And so there is a happy medium where we're striking the right balance, we're being aggressive with our sustainability recommendations, but not so much that it's breaking the budget.
So aggressive doesn't sound like getting the carbon footprint down by half in 10 years.
I would be surprised if we were at that level.
Okay, see, that is, I think, a problem. One, I think this campus should be leading. This question or this statement might be not directed to you guys, but to us guys and gals at the campus here. You know, Butte Community College up north, you might be, some people here might have heard of it, is covered with solar panels on the roofs. 75% of their energy comes solar. And they've taken the lead away from PCC in that aspect. I think this campus should be a leading campus on reducing carbon footprint. I'm going to be doing a Earth System Stewardship PD at our upcoming PD thing in March. That's on the academic side. But on the facility side, there's a parallel, ambition and goal to be met, which could be very exciting for the campus. The new STEM building. I could envision, the STEM students being involved in that process of cutting the carbon footprint of the campus, in half by 10 years, zero by 2050. it could be a very exciting thing for the campus, academically, for the students, besides being, the right thing to do. And so I'm hoping, as this plan evolves, that kind of vision can be incorporated to the maximum degree. One, so PCC is a leading campus in that area. And two, if the funding of the campus, in terms of federal money, and then maybe state money, gets tied to that kind of carbon footprint reduction on that scale that quickly, we're kind of ready to move with that. And so I'm looking forward to this plan being able to address those kinds of concerns.
Well, that's something we can actually look into in more detail as kind of comparing the current recommendations to that carbon footprint reduction plan and see kind of where we fall on that. I think that you're right, it is important that we kind of keep those larger initiatives in mind. And we always recommend that buildings serve as sustainability on display as a teaching tool for the students that occupy them, because it just spreads awareness. So in addition to kind of hitting those marks in terms of doing the right thing and getting whatever credits you can and just having a good story to tell, there is spreading awareness of the importance of sustainable design holistically kind of built into the campus environment. So
will we have access to this draft at the PCC website, or is there a way for faculty members and others to get a copy of the draft?
that is something that will happen, yes.
Hi, I'm Mike Bush. We are going to have a web page that's also going to have an email address to give input to and we're anticipating around February 18th, the draft will be made public.
Okay.
What do you guys propose to do with the V building? Like, what was the whole purpose of removing it?
Sorry, could you repeat that? We're having a little echo
With the
feedback.
V building, you guys proposed to remove it, to just leave it empty? What was the whole purpose of that?
Wait.
The V building?
Oh, the V building. Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go back to?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
So that's a specific building, and again, there's sort of an analysis which we didn't bring, but we looked at buildings and facilities and open space, not just buildings, but facilities like athletic facilities, like the tennis courts, so we were looking at specifically, obviously, the condition of the building and the condition of infrastructure. We were also looking at the capacity of buildings, how big they were, et cetera. We're looking at the utilization of the building, so how frequently and how intensively they're being used. And then we're looking at maybe more subjective requirements about the building in terms of the spaces that it makes around the building, in terms of its location and its configuration and things like that. And eventually we're coming to try to make a recommendation. Is it a building or a facility that maximizes that space on campus for the best use? So we looked at that building. It's clearly one of the workhorses of the campus. It contains a lot of classrooms. But as you can see in this diagram here, the new academic building, which is just further west of that now, that is basically where the W building and a swimming pool would be, largely that space, would replace all of that with state-of-the-art facilities. And it would create a more meaningful open space directly adjacent to the arts building. So those aren't the only two reasons why, but we thought there was an opportunity there that by taking what seemed to have a number of conditions that suggested it could be a candidate for at least extensive renovation, if not removal, by taking it out, we would be able to leverage some new opportunities in terms of other spaces. So kind of a little bit of a judo on your question. I didn't quite answer it directly, but I tried to give you enough background there. Okay?
The other thing to note is that with all of our recommendations, we really are trying to think long-term for the campus and avoid quote-unquote stopgap measures that may buy a little bit of time. So when looking at the existing facilities, some have really good bones and some not quite as much. So we really tried to kind of prioritize which buildings, which facilities have the most worth keeping in terms of making them good candidates for renovation versus demoing. There's always that kind of magic line where it makes sense to renovate something versus demo or vice versa.
If I may ask, are you worried about the pathways, about having a home for pathways and the TLC?
Everything will have a home.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable part of this community, this campus, is the TLC, the pathways space for students. So I think that anyway, that was my interpretation, that needs to be maintained somewhere on campus.
Absolutely. And the deliverable will have a much more comprehensive series of phases that show at each step what happens and what gets displaced when each project moves forward, because there is a bit of a shell game.
Yeah, the pathways part. And
you want to talk to the mic?
Yeah, sorry. To emphasize, really important. The college said from the very beginning, the career communities and the pathways is really, really important. So when you see a building where something might exist today that's a really important part of a student journey, it is not a suggestion, well, we're just taking that out and that's gone now. It's being removed so that it's enhanced. It's in a better spot. It's going to be a better space. It's going to be in a better location where it's more accessible and it really can serve its mission even better. We're not getting into that right now. So these different facilities that are going away, absolutely the program and the important parts of the community move and shift and get enhanced and optimized.
It's me again. I have a lot of questions, but I will start here. One of the things, so you mentioned creating the zones and the different things, and like we're going to, make things, and you mentioned something about accessibility, but I want to know like actual accessibility for people who may have wheelchairs or different things like that. Like how is that being addressed by moving these spaces and because you talked a lot about like these like making these paths and things like that. Like right now, I don't think our campus is very accessible at all.
Okay.
And I think we have a huge accessibility issue, not just with the layout of the campus, but also getting into buildings, getting out of buildings, getting to classrooms. I know you said that some of that's more granular, but thinking about the paths and the areas and the zones, how are you accounting for making sure all of our students will be able to access them?
Well, one thing to note is that any new project that takes place here, whether it's a new building or renovation, is going to have to go through the DSA, the Division of the State Architect, and they enforce accessibility guidelines probably more stringently than any regulatory agency in California, and California is one of the most stringent regulatory environments in the world. So I think in general, any new project is going to be at the very top of that accessibility compliance spectrum. But I think going beyond that, it is important that we address universal design in general in terms of organizing things in a way that's accessible just from an intuitive standpoint, that people can, wayfinding, things of that nature, that it's easy for anyone who's visiting the campus for the first time to understand how it's organized, how to get from point A to point B to point C. And a lot of that is really baked into this, even though we haven't called it out on these slides. That is something that we always consider.
Hi. Hello, I'm Kyle Locke. I'm the band director here at PCC, and I actually was a student here in 1982, so I've seen a lot of changes over the year. We didn't have these parking structures. That was a flat lot. The stadium was on the other side facing the east and west. I want to just bring a couple of concerns, and I apologize that I wish I'd, read my emails closer to see that there was meetings a while back. Is it possible to go to the one where you show the, after all the completion, the full project, where you show that there's the extension to Lot 4? Okay.
Right there.
Do you mind if I come up for a second? So you mentioned that there's going to be spaces to allocate for certain programs. One of the things I'm concerned about, one of the buildings I've always tried to hang on to is the W building, and it's an old building, and it needs to be. But there's a gym in there, and there's dance studios, and there's things that I'm not seeing where you're going to be able to accommodate. We desperately need to somehow have 2 gyms on this campus because we can never get into GM 220. And I know that kinesiology is using W102 quite a bit, which is one of the reasons why it hasn't been turned into a ceramics lab or facilities. And also a concern about the Lot 4 extension. One of the things that we host here, and I didn't come here as an advocate for the Turner Roses, we host BandFest here. There is absolutely nowhere to park buses and equipment trucks with that setup. When I started here in 2006, where the pool is, that was an empty lot. Mm-hmm. And that's where we were able to park all the trucks, semis, and multiple buses. Yeah. Now they're in Lot 4, but if that extension goes, Lot 3 will not be able to hold 6 bands with 7 buses and semi-trucks each. Yeah. So that's a concern. There's no way to get them into Lot 1 unless that gets refurbished completely. So I just want to kind of bring these things so they're kind of on the record that they need to be considered, or have they been considered? The Turner Roses, certainly with the BandFest and having accessibility to that stadium, has always been a challenge. One of the reasons is we hosted a marching band championships. We can't do that. DCI hosted their championships here. The problem we have is the only access to the stadium is up here for pits. So they actually had to close off Del Mar to get all the equipment, the pit equipment, into that facility. It's going to be even more challenging, possibly, if that happens with the loss of the parking. But has there also been the consideration of where the dance studios, and I don't know the academic building would be able to host all that?
So can I, go ahead, Mike, did you want to? No. Okay. You've actually sort of identified one of the buildings that we had some of the longest conversations about, which is W, okay? And I think personally, and I think on behalf of the team as well as all the executive team here, this is a plan that shows a number of different destinations, but is it really, and I think that your voice and your advocacy for certain functions that occur that are really critical functions for the campus, including the dance studios, as well as the support of like major events like the Rose Parade, et cetera, is part of the conversation. So it could drive a different solution for the parking solution here. We just are addressing the fact that there's a need for parking, and there needs to be some strategies about how that occurs. As you probably know, given how long you've been associated and been a part of this campus and this community, parking, especially structured parking, is something that is really challenging to sort of strategize about relative to its adjacency to certain uses. You know, the parking structure Lot 5 on the east is across from single-family homes. Right. So as urbanists, we're kind of sensitive to that. So where can we make more parking and, you know, accommodate the daily needs of students and staff, and at the same time not obliterate a really important function that you described? So again, I'm just going to say that I think really it is a working plan, and there's a number of ways to execute it. Okay?
I just want to make sure that was on the discussion. Yep.
Can I ask just real quickly, some of the things you described in Lot 4, could some of that happen even if there was a structure there, in terms of maybe just happening on the ground floor of the structure?
You'd have to have a very, high clearance to get semis in there.
Right.
And so would that sort of be defeating the purpose then of having a structure there in some respect? To have that kind of clearance, you're only probably using up 2 levels. I don't know if it's also an issue with exhaust.
Right.
You've got kids lined up in there and buses are going, and all of a sudden now you've got, that issue too. I just see look, I was a student here when we didn't have structures, and I remember sitting out in that lot waiting an hour and a half to find a spot, so I remember those old days. And I think it's important that we have these lots, but I'm also concerned that we just keep losing that space.
Right.
And it's important. We do have an existing lot 4. It's already there. It's just, I don't know if there's a way to utilize that. And, I'm just putting that out there, that it makes it now, that particular design and all that makes it impossible really to have space for that accommodation.
Right, and some of this, it's a balancing act between incorporating it in this plan, but then also saying some of this is really more at the project level, in terms of we think conceivably it can be worked into one of these projects, and as long as we know that that is an important function. Certainly, we can capture that. So we'd be happy to hear more about that in terms of kind of the specific needs that you're referring to. But I think on a high-level sense, it's workable, because the campus is landlocked, and in terms of moving forward, it's going to continue to become, the densification it's a necessity, so that means giving up more and more real estate, building up, and so that is going to require some creative solutions to some of these things that have worked in the past but may not work in the future as it continues to evolve.
Hi, I'm Sherry Samirian from the counseling department, and continuing with the conversation on parking, I was wondering, with lot 1 and 7, with the green spaces being added in, is that taking away from the parking spaces for staff? And if so, is West Lot going to be for staff, or is that going to be a combined student staff type of replacement?
I don't think we've determined that in specifics. I think it could go either way, and that's something, we talk about the fluidity. I don't think we need to decide that right now.
Okay.
But the idea is really to supplement some of the surface lots that we're losing with the structure that is going vertical.
Okay, and to add a second part to that, with the concerns about an extension to Lot 4, have you considered or building a structure in Lot 10 or 11 on green?
Yeah, Lot 10 and 11 were discussed during the process, but currently it's our understanding that the college does not own those properties.
Okay.
So it's not up to the college and the district to project future facilities there.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm over here. I'm Nick, an instructor, full-time instructor of nutrition here. First, wanted to say that I see a lot of things that I brought up that were brought up at the Senate meeting previously, kind of incorporated into what you presented today, and I just wanted to thank you for that. I feel very heard. I was also wondering about those other lots west, but you've addressed that. Lot 5 has got one sub-level, and I was wondering if is it feasible to bury some of these lots and then put things on top of them so that we can both increase green space, usable space, functional space, as well as have parking? Or is that just unfeasible as you start to go down?
Anything's possible. It's just a matter of how much money you want to spend on it.
Right.
And so we're trying to, just like with sustainability, we're trying to strike that right balance. This really is envisioned to be actionable, that it's not too much pie in the sky, so to speak. And so yes, that is something we discussed. I think with the Lot 5 structure, there were some, I would say, the grade really kind of lent it to go partially underground. So it's not an impossibility, but currently we're not accounting for anything like that.
Okay. And then kind of on a similar vein, with the new buildings that are being built, I wonder if it's feasible to make the roofs of those buildings accessible for doing things, like for putting greenhouses on top of the new Serafian building, and solar panels on top of a building, making them, accessible spaces that we could maybe use them for something.
Absolutely. We're always in support of kind of making use of outdoor space, not only on ground floor, but on upper levels. There is a cost premium to that as well, but given the climate, this really is ideal for that type of functionality.
Cool. Thank you.
I'm next. Hi. So you mentioned that FTES growth was taken into account, and while you were clustering where things went and what got attention. So my question for that is, because I saw that English was on the low end of that in terms of a major or career community. However, the English division teaches a lot of required intro courses. And so I'm curious, when you're thinking about those spaces and how they're used, are you also taking into account that? Because math, STEM seemed like math is part of STEM, so that seemed pretty well accounted for, but I didn't get a sense that English was taken into account in the same way, or ESL, which also provides sort of those same services. And so how is that being measured?
So for that, I would recommend, the career communities diagram that we have is really a summary. And I would encourage you to wait to see some of the more detailed metrics in the draft report that we can then discuss further.
I have a question more than a recommendation. You had mentioned that we're landlocked. Has there been any consideration, and I don't know anything about cost of real estate here, were you looking off campus? I know we have the CDC and Foundation, down Green Street, and I know St. Philip's is right there. But was there any consideration for around the area, or are you kind of sticking to just within these parameters?
So, yes, it's not cheap here, as everyone knows. But those were the parameters that we were really established or given is that there would not be, that's kind of an unknown, but for the purposes of this report and this analysis, we should not be counting on anything like that. I think there's always, kind of one thought that maybe there could be opportunities for land acquisition, but it's just too much of an unknown right now.
Hi.
Hi.
This was about it was a follow-up to the parking. We were talking about parking, and I had forgotten because I feel like, I've had some conversations with people. We don't have a lot of spaces for handicap parking. And so when we're thinking about redesigning the lots and how they're used, again, back to accessibility and accounting for making sure that there's enough space for everyone to have that kind of parking. So I don't know where in your different, I know that's more granular than what we're talking about here, but when you're considering the lots and where they're placed and as well, are we thinking about those things is what I would like to know.
Right, so within any given lot, the mandate would be to, there's a code required minimum for how many accessible spots you have, how many normal accessible, van accessible, et cetera. And I believe it's 2% of spaces? 2% of the total count of stalls. But I think there's that's the general rule of thumb. I think there's a sliding scale that the bigger the lot, the smaller percentage gets. But in general, the code is very clear about how many spots you need to provide. And it's also very clear about where they need to go within that lot. So any work that's done on a lot is going to essentially introduce the latest code. I think part of the problem with accessibility on this campus or on any campus is that there's a lot that's grandfathered in. Over the years, before 1990, the ADA didn't even exist. So it was all recommendations. So in the last 30 years, we have seen a lot of kind of transformation with the built environment, but there's a lot that came before that is completely not to code today. So as these projects move forward, a lot of that is going to trigger upgrades, and you're going to see a huge kind of push forward in terms of how many accessibility provisions are on campus in general, just based on the bare minimum code requirement. So for a parking lot, that would mean putting accessible stalls at the closest area to wherever that lot is serving, making sure that they're connected to the campus-wide accessible route, making sure that they have protection from vehicle aisles, et cetera.
Okay, I have another question. Because I think this goes back to what we were saying about like the Pathway Center, and because I see, academic buildings, student services, you were talking about creating these spaces. And so thinking about the centers that serve like the multicultural spaces, safe zones, different places like that, is the plan what's the plan for where to house them? Are they all going to be kind of centrally located, or is it spread out based on, I didn't get a clear sense of that from.
Do you want to capture?
So we are deliberately refraining from locating programs specifically. We want to have some guidelines about where a program might live on the campus and where it might be adjacent to other compatible things. But it really needs to be driven on a project-by-project basis. It's really the next level of this exercise, okay? So you'll see that, and you'll have opportunities to weigh in on that, but it's not what we're identifying right now in this report. Mike?
One of the things that came out in the student services visioning session is for the various affinity groups across campus, they wanted to have unique spaces, but they wanted to be able to identify across campus at various spaces. So there's student services and student support is going to be distributed throughout the campus. There's certain functions like A&R needs to stay centrally. But then we also have populations like veterans. Where's the best place to put veterans? Some of the ideas coming across right now is when we modernize R to have it across the quad from student services. So when a student comes and asks for assistance, they could say, right across the quad, you can find that. So it's going to be a combination of distributed and centralized.
Kind of piggybacking off of that question, have you all had conversations regarding like the academic success centers? I remember on one of the previous slides it said that there was conversation regarding strategically removing, I don't remember the exact language, certain labs and centers. Are those all going to be centralized? And if so, which building will they be in? Or are you considering putting them in?
It's really the same answer. And I know it feels like we're sort of like avoiding the question, but it's actually the principle of this plan. And not to avoid things, but to leave the flexibility to address it effectively in the future. It's a framework. So I absolutely think that it's going to have a home, and it's going to be in the right spot. But at this level, we're just providing options and ideas about where things might go.
I just wanted to make a comment about the accessibility questions. I'm looking at this, and I don't know if this was intentional or, unintentional and very intuitive. But if you look at the 3 buildings that are most likely going to be done away with and replaced, the V building, the W building, and the L building, they're 3 of the most inaccessible buildings on campus. And with removing them and repurposing those spaces, in and of itself, you have a plan that makes the L building more accessible, makes the W building more accessible, and makes the V building more accessible. And I think that needs to be highlighted, that these are solutions that are showing forward thinking and accessibility.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the things that came out in our last conversation with your group, which was conversation a bit about justice, social justice, of access to facilities, and I can't remember which building it was, but there's a building where the one gender has to wait in lines that goes out the door and the other gender doesn't, and there's things like that were occurring in facilities. So I think you're addressing it. And I'm not sure it was more than one of those 3, but the idea of accessibility as a means of justice, throughout the campus was a really, really important idea. The only other thing I'll say is that you have a campus with a lot of topography, and that just presents all sorts of complications in terms of movement around the campus. It's just one of the conditions.
Okay. Well, thank you for all those great questions. Glad to see everyone so engaged. Want to wrap it up?
Okay, well, once again, thank you all for being here and for your insightful questions and comments. I'm sure you've given this team something to think about, and Dr. Bush in the room who's been involved in spearheading this effort as well. And as Dr. Andrew said, she will be reviewing this as well. So those of you who wanted something on record, a concern or an idea that you had, I'm glad that you were able to take advantage of that opportunity. Thank you to HGA for taking time out of your day to come here. And thank you all for being here.
All